Within the sprawling, morally fractured tapestry of Game of Thrones, Cersei Lannister is universally reduced to a one-dimensional villain, a cruel, power-obsessed queen whose unbridled cruelty stems from an insatiable hunger for the Iron Throne. Casual viewers label her a mad tyrant, a vengeful matriarch, and a bitter schemer who destroys anyone standing between herself and unrivaled royal authority. This surface-level assessment misdiagnoses the core engine driving every choice, betrayal, and catastrophic act of destruction across her lifetime. Cersei's reign of terror is not birthed by a simple lust for crown and territory. It is the inevitable outworking of severe malignant narcissism, a clinical personality disorder defined by grandiosity, an absolute lack of empathy, a compulsive need for total control, and a crippling fear of any perceived slight to her inflated self-image. Psychologically, malignant narcissism differs sharply from ordinary vanity or ambition. Where a standard power seeker craves status as a reward for achievement, the malignant narcissist views all people, titles, and even blood relatives as mere extensions of their own ego. Love, loyalty, and familial bond cease to exist as independent emotional ties. They become tools to prop up a fragile, towering sense of self-worth that cannot endure failure, criticism, or equal standing with another human being. For Cersei, Westeros itself is nothing more than a stage built to validate her inherent superiority as a Lannister, a queen, and a figure destined for unmatched dominion. Every man, woman, and child in the realm exists only to serve her ego supply, whether through obedience, fear, or submission. Those who resist, challenge, or outshine her become threats that must be erased without mercy. This analysis will dissect Cersei's entire life arc through the rigorous lens of narcissistic personality theory, dismantling the false narrative of overprotective mother to expose maternal affection as a carefully masked vehicle for ego projection. We will trace how her rigid self-mythology of golden, unrivaled legacy warped her relationships with Joffrey and Tommen, unpack how Maggie the Frog's childhood prophecy entrenched a lifelong victimhood complex that fueled scorched earth tactics, examine the wildfire detonation at the Sept of Baelor as the ultimate narcissistic collapse, and conclude by unpacking her enduring cultural resonance as a timeless archetype of the narcissistic caregiver. By the final act of this breakdown, it becomes irrefutable. Cersei's throne, her children, her wealth, and her power were never ends in their own right. They were mirrors, shields, and fuel for a self that could not bear to be diminished, even if burning the whole world to ash was the price of preserving her fragile grandiosity. Gold and mirrors. Grandiosity as the foundation of her ego. Cersei's narcissism is rooted in a lifelong grandiosity forged within the opulent, status-obsessed halls of Casterly Rock. House Lannister's mantra, "A Lannister always pays his debts," was twisted by Cersei into a personal creed of inherent, unassailable superiority. From girlhood, she absorbed the lesson that gold, lineage, and power mark a natural hierarchy. Lannisters stand above all other houses, and she, as the eldest daughter of Tywin Lannister, occupied a tier higher still. Mirrors and golden regalia become recurring visual motifs that anchor her self-perception. Time and again, she stands before polished glass to adjust crowns, silk gowns, and jewels, gazing not at a mortal woman, but at the living embodiment of unrivaled Lannister supremacy. The mirror does not reflect flaws, frailty, or vulnerability. It reinforces the myth she has constructed of herself as untouchable, born to rule, entitled to deference from every living soul. Tywin's parenting amplified this toxic framework. He valued Cersei only insofar as she could serve the house's political advancement through marriage and dynastic heirs, never nurturing genuine emotional connection or teaching humility. Denied unconditional parental love, Cersei's ego hardened into a defensive fortress. If the world would not love her for who she was, she would force the world to submit to the grand version of herself she manufactured. Gold becomes synonymous with her worth. Poverty, low birth, or humble station are not merely different paths in life, but inherent signs of inferiority that validate her right to dominate lesser folk. This grandiosity creates an irreversible blind spot to her own failures. Narcissistic grandiosity cannot reconcile imperfection. Every misstep must be externalized, blamed on others, never attributed to flawed judgment on her part. When her schemes unravel, from alienating the Tyrells to underestimating Daenerys Targaryen's dragon power, she never interrogates her own miscalculations. Instead, she casts rivals, advisors, and even her own kin as incompetent traitors out to undermine her divine right to reign. She cannot acknowledge that Margaery Tyrell's gentle populism wins genuine public affection, or that Jon Snow's integrity earns loyal bannermen. Such realities shatter the core belief that she alone deserves adoration and obedience. Her obsession with legacy amplifies this mirror complex further. Legacy is not a gift to pass down to beloved children, but an extension of her own existence. A lasting Lannister dynasty led by her blood ensures her name, her power, her grand self-image will persist long after her mortal life ends. The dynasty is not separate from Cersei. It is Cersei, stretched across generations of heirs who carry her ego forward. Gold and mirrors do not merely decorate her world. They define the very boundary between her inflated self and the ordinary, flawed reality she refuses to accept. Children as self-extension, maternal love as a narcissistic shield. The most devastating deception Cersei perpetuates, both to the court and to herself, is the fiction of fierce, self-sacrificing maternal love. To outside observers, she is a mother consumed by protective rage, willing to burn kingdoms to safeguard her boys, Joffrey and Tommen. Clinical narcissism exposes this as hollow performance. Her sons are never autonomous, beloved individuals with their own hopes, fears, and identities. They function exclusively as living vessels for her ego, physical shields against a hostile world, and tangible proof that her legacy will endure. Affection she displays toward them is conditional, tied entirely to how well they uphold her grand self-image. When they deviate from the role she assigns them, her fondness curdles into resentment, neglect, or unforgiving control. Joffrey Baratheon embodies the dark side of this dynamic. Cersei indulges every sadistic, cruel impulse within him because his brutality mirrors her own suppressed rage against the realm that judges and limits her. Joffrey's viciousness is not corrected, it is validated, for a violent, unyielding heir projects strength onto Cersei's own reign. She encourages his public executions, his torment of Sansa Stark, and his arrogant disregard for noble custom, seeing in his tyranny an extension of her own unspoken desire to crush every constraint placed upon her. Joffrey is allowed to be the unfiltered version of herself she cannot safely display as a queen, constrained by court decorum. When he is poisoned at his wedding, her grief is genuine yet skewed. She mourns not merely the loss of a son, but the collapse of a vital piece of her ego infrastructure, a perfect vessel for her power and cruelty snatched away prematurely. Tommen Baratheon represents the opposite pole, a gentle, timid boy whose quiet goodness clashes violently with Cersei's need for a ruthless dynastic figurehead. Where Joffrey amplified her aggression, Tommen's softness becomes a flaw she cannot abide, a failure of her own legacy projection. She does not nurture his gentle spirit, she suffocates it under suffocating control, forcing him into a loveless political marriage with Margaery, barring him from forming independent bonds and crushing every flicker of personal autonomy. Tommen's humanity threatens her grand narrative. A weak, merciful king undermines the myth of unbreakable Lannister dominance she has spent her life cultivating. Cersei views Margaery's compassionate influence over Tommen as a theft of her own son, a rival ego stealing her most precious extension. The toll of this instrumental parenting is catastrophic. Joffrey grows into an unhinged tyrant, incapable of empathy or measured rule. Tommen's spirit is broken entirely, leading him to leap from the Red Keep battlements after witnessing the sept explosion that kills his wife and faith leaders. Neither boy is ever permitted to exist outside of Cersei's ego needs. Maternal care here is not nourishment for a child's soul, it is armor for a narcissist's fragile self, forged from the flesh and blood of the two people who should have been her greatest treasures. Prophecy, paranoia, Maggie the Frog, and the permanent victim. Mindset, narcissism, thrives on external blame, and Maggie the Frog's childhood prophecy supplied Cersei with a lifelong, unshakable framework for victimhood that amplified every destructive decision she would make in adulthood. As a young girl visiting the witch in Lannisport, Cersei received a devastating forecast. She would marry a king, bear 3 children who would all die young, and be supplanted as queen by a younger, more beautiful woman before meeting her own violent end. Rather than interpret this as a warning to temper her pride and cruelty, Cersei's narcissistic psyche reframed the prophecy as proof that the world was inherently stacked against her inherent greatness. She did not see the prophecy as a reflection of choices she would make. She saw it as a malicious plot by fate to rob her of her rightful glory. A core trait of malignant narcissism is the persistent victim complex. The self is always blameless, and all suffering originates from outside forces envious of one's superiority. Maggie's words locked Cersei into this cycle permanently. Every loss, Joffrey's murder, Tommen's despair, threats to her crown, was not a consequence of her own cruelty or poor governance, but the prophecy's hostile workings, the scheming of jealous rivals, a universe determined to tear down the Lannister queen. This mindset erases personal accountability entirely. If fate is already conspiring to ruin her, brutal, preemptive strikes become justified self-defense. Any rival woman with youth, charm, or popular support becomes the younger, more beautiful queen, foretold, an existential threat to eliminate before she can seize power. Margaery Tyrell bears the brunt of this paranoia first. Margaery's youth, gentle charisma, and broad public adoration fit Cersei's warped reading of the prophecy perfectly, turning the Tyrell heiress from a political ally into a mortal enemy overnight. Cersei views Margaery's bond with Tommen as calculated theft of her son and her throne, a deliberate plot to fulfill the witch's prediction. Later, Daenerys Targaryen, a powerful, youthful queen with dragons and a liberated army, solidifies Cersei's conviction that annihilation looms unless she strikes first. Every enemy is framed as an agent of the prophecy's curse, every act of violence framed as necessary self-preservation against a world that hates her unrivaled worth. This paranoia creates a self-fulfilling cycle unique to narcissistic prophecy fixation. Cersei's scorched earth retaliations, her refusal to compromise, her relentless elimination of potential threats only feed the chaos and hostility that bring the prophecy's events closer to fruition. She fears being dethroned so fiercely that her desperate, cruel efforts to hold power are exactly what alienate allies, push her children to despair, and set the stage for her own bloody demise. The prophecy was never a binding fate. It was a mirror held up to her unregulated narcissism, a blueprint for ruin she chose to follow step by step. The Ash Throne. Wildfire as narcissistic collapse. The detonation of wildfire beneath the sept of Baelor stands as the definitive moment of full narcissistic collapse, the point where Cersei's grand ego can no longer sustain the gap between her inflated self-image and the mounting threats closing in on her control. A narcissistic collapse occurs when the supply of ego validation dries up, when threats to one's supremacy become unignorable, and when the false self cannot mask inner fragility any longer. For Cersei, the Sept crisis stacked every possible narcissistic injury into one catastrophic pressure point: Margaery's growing influence over Tommen, the Faith militants' defiance of royal authority, the High Sparrow's populist religious power base, and the looming risk of public trial and humiliation that would shatter her untouchable, queenly myth forever. A functional, empathetic ruler would pursue negotiation, compromise, or strategic mercy to defuse the crisis. A malignant narcissist with no capacity for emotional surrender sees only two binary outcomes: total control or total annihilation. If she cannot retain absolute dominion over her son, her throne, and the realm's narrative, she will reduce the source of all threats to smouldering ash. The wildfire plot is not merely a ruthless political purge. It is the ultimate expression of the narcissist's "if I cannot have it, no one can." Thousands of innocent worshippers, noble lords, faith leaders, and Margaery herself are disposable collateral, erased without remorse because their existence challenges her ego's absolute supremacy. Visually and emotionally, the explosion lays bare the hollow core of her maternal facade. Moments after watching the sept burn to the ground, Cersei stands at the Red Keep window and wears a cold, triumphant smile, reveling in the obliteration of her rivals. Yet this victory costs her the last living extension of her ego. Tommen, witnessing the slaughter of his wife and spiritual mentors, loses all will to live and leaps to his death. Here the contradiction of her maternal narcissism peaks. She destroyed the world to protect her legacy vessel, only to destroy the vessel itself in the process. Her grand victory is an empty shell. She secures the Iron Throne, yet loses the last piece of the self-propagated legacy that justified all her bloodshed. This collapse reshapes her reign entirely from that point onward. Abandoned by the last of her children, stripped of the maternal shield that softened public perception of her tyranny, Cersei embraces unfiltered, scorched earth autocracy. There are no more half measures, no calculated displays of restraint, no attempts to uphold even a veneer of benevolent rule. Every enemy, every potential rival, every house that does not bow instantly faces annihilation. Her narcissism no longer needs subtle masking. The collapse has burned away every thin layer of performative decency she once maintained for court approval. She rules atop a throne built of ash, a monument to the cost of prioritizing an inflated ego over human life, love, and stability. The throne of ash is not a reward for her victory. It is a prison for a self that has burned every possible source of genuine connection and ego balance to the ground. Cersei's timeless archetype of narcissistic caregivers. To synthesize the full psychological portrait, Cersei Lannister's entire trajectory confirms she is Westeros's most unflinching illustration of malignant narcissism, with every celebrated flaw of cruelty, ambition, and vengefulness tracing back to a core ego structure that cannot tolerate imperfection, challenge, or equal standing. She never loved her children as separate souls. She loved what they represented for her own glory. She never craved the Iron Throne for the power to lift up the realm. She craved it as the ultimate mirror to confirm her inherent superiority over every other living person in Westeros. Her fear of the prophecy was not rational caution against danger, but a narcissist's terror of having their grand self-narrative dismantled by fate and rival hands. The wildfire at the sept was not tactical genius, but the implosion of a false self built on gold, mirrors, and borrowed identity from her offspring. Where other villains in the saga draw strength from magic, armies, or dragonfire, Cersei's only weapon is her unregulated narcissism, a force far more corrosive than wildfire or ice magic, for it rots the foundation of family, loyalty, and governance from within long before battle lines are drawn. Her legacy is a stark moral warning. Love twisted into ego extension does not protect, it devours. A parent who sees children as trophies and extensions rather than autonomous beings will crush their spirit to prop up their own fragile self-worth, just as Cersei crushed Joffrey and Tommen beneath the weight of her grandiosity and control. Her enduring cultural relevance stems from how perfectly she embodies the modern archetype of the narcissistic caregiver, a figure audiences recognize in real-world family dynamics across generations. Even decades after the show's initial release, viewers dissect her choices because her conflict is universal. The struggle between protecting loved ones and controlling them, between personal pride and genuine self-sacrificial love. She is not a one-off fantasy tyrant. She is an amplified, dramatic rendering of a very human failing, the inability to separate one's own ego from the people they claim to love. Do you believe Cersei's narcissism excuses her unforgivable atrocities, or does her personality disorder merely explain a lifetime of calculated cruelty? Between Joffrey and Tommen, which boy's tragedy best illustrates how instrumental her maternal affection truly was? And do you see her as the most psychologically complex villain in Game of Thrones, overshadowing even the Night King and Ramsay Bolton in thematic depth? Share your reasoned analysis and perspectives fully within the comment thread below.